I think it's fair to say, you know, as I pointed out, this is the hot topic at the moment. We all want to make sure that our staff are coming back to safe workplaces and safe work practices. And obviously we want to make sure that our businesses are safe as well in terms of anything in the future that might crop up. So I'm going to introduce you to Paul Perry. Paul is the General Manager of Atlas Safety Management, who do health and safety and risk assessments and training. Paul, I'm going to hand over to you just in one moment. A couple of bits of housekeeping. As I've already said, we will keep everybody muted except for Paul, so that everyone can hear clearly. If you have questions through this, can you please put them in the chat as we go through, and we'll come to all the questions at the end. It may well be that it's covered as we go, but if you've got any questions, anything specific you want to know about, please feel free to add that into there. And I'm going to hand over to Paul Perry from Atlas Safety Management. Over to you, Paul.
Well, good morning, everyone. Alistair's done my introduction for me, so that knocks a bit of that out. So just a very, very quick introduction. Because of the sheer diversity of businesses and individual arrangements that may be that this is going to apply to, what I've tried to do is give as broad, simplistic and kind of all-encompassing overview, which not everything will apply to everyone. So it's basically a case of, look, if this applies to you, there's some considerations for you. I'm going to list a little bit later on. They are merely considerations, okay, but we'll get into that a little bit more later on. So if they apply, take what's applicable to you, leave the rest. So this isn't a very specific for manufacturing. It literally, I'm trying to encompass everything, remove out all of the stuff we've heard, take away the, and basically just leave us with what's important to us. So the topic today, COVID-19, returning to work, which, you know, for those of us unable to work from home, we were actively encouraged to do so on the 13th of May-ish, depending on which view, which instruction you took from the government. Alistair, next slide, please. So what we're going to be discussing, the topics, very straightforward, 4 simple topics. The legal position, so we're dealing with that. We then have to, for the purposes of getting to the requirements for work, we then have to do a brief revisit of COVID-19. Some of this, I mean, this has been done to death, but for the purposes of what we're trying to achieve here for clarity, etc., we just need to revisit and just make sure that we're all absolutely on the same page. Then we're looking at managing those risks and the workplace accidents and emergencies. Okay, so next slide, please, Alistair. Okay, the HSE, so the governing body for all health and safety in the UK, they have made it very clear that their focus will shift to reflect the current climate. As such, they've made, again, made it very clear that there's going to be a concerted and ongoing effort to visit businesses, to establish what arrangements you have in place and evaluate how you as businesses are managing the COVID-19 risk. Now, the government's guidelines, they're mainly, they are non-statutory, so they're not a legal requirement, but they are in place in accordance with HSE guidelines. So some of the considerations they're putting out there, basically what I'm trying to say is, they're not saying this is what you must do. They are considerations, they're non-statutory, but they are directly connected with the current health and safety employment law. They're not going to deal just with COVID-19, obviously, as well as their normal everyday activities. That's part of it, but there is going to be a concerted and ongoing effort to establish what's going on out there. That any non-conformances will be treated harshly. It's such a big topic. As we all know, it's unprecedented, it's in the public eye. So what I mean by that, any non-conformances of a serious nature, it's reasonable to assume there's not going to be just a slap on the wrist, let's get that done. There's likely to be serious and immediate enforcement actions, severe reputation damage for the business, and potentially large financial penalties for non-conformances. So if we look at the current slogan that applies at this time only to England, stay alert, control the virus, save lives. That may read better, perhaps be more understandable if it said, control the virus by the actions that we're going to take as businesses, as owners, as employers, as employees. Stay alert, don't lose focus on what you and others are doing, and save lives, which is self-explanatory. Next slide, please, Alistair. Okay, so in essence, there are no changes to existing laws, nothing. Everything remains exactly the same. And to keep things simple, as I'm hoping to do throughout the presentation, what that means is the law in this country requires that all UK workplaces must be safe. COVID-19 is simply another foreseeable and significant risk. Everything else stays in place. So risk assessments, inspection, testing, reporting, all still apply. So if we we've got to deal with these things first so we know where we are moving forward. Testing and inspection. Again, some of this won't apply to you, but the stuff that does, please take on board. So if we're looking at testing and inspection, lifting equipment, electrical safety, etc. The HSE have stated that they will take a pragmatic and proportionate approach, but for any non-conformances, the employer must, and I stress that, must be able to demonstrate and prove that such equipment that is non-conforming, that is in use, it must be critical and used as part of your operations. Okay, so if it's an absolutely critical piece of equipment that must be used to enable you to do your work, that's where it will apply. And then we'll take a pragmatic approach to see that you've done everything you can. You've got to be able to demonstrate you took all reasonable steps to make sure you comply. Along with that, you must make sure still that if it's a non-compliance, a certificate run out, a testing inspection from Lola, for example, you must be able to demonstrate that that equipment, by whatever means, is safe to use. Riddle, so the reporting of certain incidents and accidents at work, with specific regard to COVID-19, you must still report any incidents of exposure of COVID-19, a death by COVID-19 that could be reasonably assumed was contracted at work. But the reporting of COVID-19 will apply almost exclusively to those in the medical profession where exposure is likely. A death is a strong potential. So in most businesses, it's not going to apply to you. Next slide, please, Alistair. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm sure everyone's been watching this with interest and we kind of know everything that's on the slide in front of you. What we do absolutely know from this absolutely brand new virus, we know it's extremely infectious. So why are we putting in measures now? What separates COVID-19 from the more virulent and widespread common flu, common cold, etc.? We know it's extremely infectious. It's presented in infected saliva or mucus. It's transferred from human to human by touch or inhalation. So right there in that sentence, human to human by touch or inhalation, all the clues we need to control this virus are right there in that one line. And this will form the main part of this presentation to guide you towards protection and compliance. Currently, no vaccine. I think it's worth noting that a vaccine might never be found, or it might be in September, depends on, so the range is from September to never, okay? That's quite a broad range. So any arrangements we make today, they may not be so temporary. And it's worth putting that in mind for when you're thinking of, right, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. You may need to take a longer view approach that this actually could be in for quite a while. Next slide, please, Alistair. So we're going to be looking at maintaining the space between you and others. These are going to be the predominant control measures. Maintaining space between you and others, and hygiene. I need to go back and just let you know that we are told that although there are groups of people classed as vulnerable, and they've highlighted people over 70 and those with certain underlying health issues, they're more likely to develop serious health issues if they contract COVID-19. But the reality is everyone is at risk, everyone. So there's many reported cases of health conditions that weren't even identified and they were unknown until COVID-19 was contracted. There is also some there's some statistical evidence to suggest that members from the Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds may be more susceptible to the risk of COVID-19 than their white counterparts. These are classified, they've termed these as BAME, and it's just another consideration. So the reason we haven't got these measures in to control the cold, flu, for example, is purely down to the mortality rate. There's a huge difference. Okay, so these are the predominant control measures. This is what we're going to be looking at. I'm keeping this as simple as possible. What you're seeing on your screen is it. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, please, Alistair. Sorry, can you go back, actually? I want to just deal with this one in much more depth. So, maintaining space between you and others. We've come to know and love this as social distancing, okay? Very straightforward, social distancing, maintaining space. So we have, there are minute aerosol, not in aerosol for the terms we want it for. We're looking at particles suspended and dispersed in air. Now there's two types. When we breathe, when we talk, when we cough, when we sneeze, these minute particles come out in various sizes. So the minute ones, the smallest of them all, are aerosol. Okay, they have long-range possibility of long-range transmission. So up to about 4 meters. The larger sprays, they're classified as droplets. Now they have a short range transmission of less than 2 meters. So like I say, these are expelled when we speak, cough, simply talking, sneezing. Now the droplets are relatively heavy. They quickly fall to the ground, and for this reason alone, social distancing is critical. They can't get to you. And it's also worth noting that our social distance value is 2 meters. This is double that recommended by the World Health Organization, and so most of the rest of the world have been maintaining 1 meter. They've been recommending 1 meter. We're double that. When we look at hygiene, we're obviously looking principally on our regular cleaning of our hands, but it also applies to the sanitation of surfaces, which we know for a fact are a breeding ground of COVID-19. Now, how long the virus remains on a surface and can remain alive and contagious, not yet an exact science, and it depends on many factors. So we've got type of surface, the heat, the humidity conditions. But estimates range between a few hours to several days, depending on that surface and all those conditions. Now, the first and most effective defense, hygiene defense we have, is to thoroughly wash our hands with soap and water. Applying alcohol-based hand sanitizer is by far secondary to this, by far. For the hygiene of our hands, preferable warm water, foaming soap. It lifts the proteins and lifts the virus from the skin, and it gets carried away. It kills, it's gone. There is also strong evidence for those people relying mainly or in some part or another on hand sanitizers, that anything with less than a 60% alcohol content may be ineffective, completely ineffective. Now, this can offer a false sense of protection and can lead to some potentially serious issues. So worth bearing that in mind. So predominant control measures, those they're it. Maintaining space, so social distancing, hygiene. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. Alistair, thank you. So everything on the next 2 slides, they're all designed to keep people apart. Again, these are considerations. What applies for you, use, what don't, what's not practical, you know, what can't be done, you simply can't do. But what you must do by law is consider, identify the risks. We know what the risk is. Contract and transfer of COVID-19. So we know what the risk is. We know it's significant. It's foreseeable. So what you have to do by law, as you all know, is to consider how we control these, any risk. So some of these are right in front of you. So stagger start and finish times. Introduce shifts. Limit the amount of people permitted to occupy and remain in communal areas. Now this can also be applied to the use of, and should be applied to the use of entrance and exit points. So where people would normally congregate to get into a building, to get out of a building. If we are staggering shifts, so we've reduced our shift size to X amount, all that work will be undone if we haven't backtracked it to where people are actually coming in. If we're simply going to group people back there as opposed to here. So those considerations for staggering that use and occupancy of any area, so you're looking at the whole picture, where they turn up, when they turn up, how many people are there, and when they are there, that social distance has to be maintained. So, clocking in areas, classic example. If we're staggering start and finish times, and we're staggering the amount of time or occupancy of a particular place, roll that out across rest periods, lunch breaks. Prohibit the use, or stagger or limit the amount of people permitted to use lifts, use smoking areas. This is where people are going to congregate. This is where contact is going to be made. So we're dealing with all of the issues here. Humans, we're talking skin contact, we're talking close proximity. Utilize spare offices to create more working space. If there are parts of your premises that doesn't get used for whatever reason, use it. All you're doing, and what you're doing there, not only are your arrangements to provide social distancing, you are also able to introduce more of your workforce across a wider area. Everything becomes relative. When people are at work, if you're working in a premises, in a fixed location, encourage all your staff to remain on site during the working day. These are simple procedures. If, whilst they're on site, they don't leave site, you're far less likely that they're going to go off, be potentially exposed, and bring that back in at the end of each shift or after a lunch break, etc. Can we move on to the next slide, Alistair, please? Discontinue the use of the canteen. It's a very straightforward measure. You simply prohibit it. And ask staff to bring their own food and take their rest and lunch periods individually in their own vehicles. Prohibit or limit vehicle sharing. Now, okay, we can't prohibit individual, vehicles owned by individuals, but you can strongly encourage it. And for company vehicles, you can absolutely prohibit it. So if we've got a van bringing construction workers to a site, it's no good getting to the site and having all the arrangements for social distancing and hygiene there if for the journey there and back again, we've simply crammed everybody in. It's a pointless exercise, and it's non-compliant, which is, I think, a point I'm going to keep pushing about the compliance. We'll get to that nearer the end. Prohibit visitors, non-essential contractors. Again, some of this might come across as, well, goodness me, this is simple. That's the point. That is the whole point of this. Visitors, non-essential contractors, they're just that, they're non-essential. It's no point, or there is no benefit to introducing more people to a workplace where you've done everything beforehand to limit people. Very straightforward measures. Review, adjust and plan working practices to reduce the group size. Now, across the relevant parties within the UK, these are referred to as cohorts. So you have a team of people, and it's the same people in a reduced group size. It's not shifted in, so this person is now in this shift, those two are out, and so on and so forth. But even with reduced group size, it may seem obvious, but if you was normally running a shift with this particular area has 10 people in it, we reduced it to 5, those 5 still need to have social distancing. Simply by reducing it isn't enough. You then have to, you've lessened it. You need then to consider hygiene and social distancing. And undertake telephone or video call meetings instead of face-to-face. If you can, and a face-to-face meeting is absolutely essential for whatever reason, if possible, hold them outside. Any work, the transfer of COVID-19 outside is 30 times, estimated 30 times less likely to happen than inside. It's that's a huge difference. So these are just considerations. And of course, those of you looking at, well, we can't possibly do that. Okay, you can't do that. These are considerations for the people that can. And if you can, you know, to go back to the vehicles, encourage people, perhaps they can walk, cycle, instead of using cars, for example. If it just breaks down, there's not, to be honest with you, that barring environmental issues, there's not a huge advantage to, if they're coming in their vehicles, swapping it for a bike or whatever, but it's considerations for those people perhaps with a little bit further to go, and well, cars, you know, cars a nice thing to use. Well, there is options: walk, cycle. Next slide, please, Alistair. Thank you. So, one-way pedestrian traffic routes. So these now are examples of controlling the social distancing. You know, consider installing temporary walkways simply by turning tables, creating a barrier using tape to create these walkways. 2 tables on their end, or one large table turned one way, will create a 2-way traffic system with certainly enough distance between to prevent the droplet size. We know it can't travel further than 2 meters, unless, of course, you know, sneezed directly at you, which is a completely different sort of scenario that perhaps I'm not going to get into now. Erect screens. Now, there's a lot of, I've noticed a lot of activity and adverse comments about the screens. I think what's important here is a solid surface is a solid surface. The screens that people are being asked to put up as a consideration, they don't need to be the all singing, all dancing type of screen that costs hundreds of pounds. Again, a solid surface is a solid surface. It could be anything, cardboard, anything. The issue which hasn't been addressed, I don't think fully, is when you erect a screen, anything you do like that, you are introducing a secondary hazard. So anything you put in place now has to be hygienically cleaned. So we can't move away that we put the screens up, we're done. Now you simply move to the hygiene stage of it's gone up, now that forms part of your cleaning program. This bottom one, don't undertake any non-essential work. It can seem so obvious, but just for the sake of getting people back to work for work that actually doesn't need to be undertaken, you as employers would have to justify why any work you're doing which is classed as non-essential, it doesn't help the business in any way, whatever that might be, you'd have to justify on any spot inspection by the HSE or any other enforcing authority why you've permitted that to work. You don't need it, don't do it. It's very, very straightforward. You know, one of the things that I've noticed that are happening in offices, they've simply moved tables to allow 2-meter distance and side-by-side working. So anything that is being expelled, whether it be an aerosol, the tiny, tiny, minute particles or the droplets, they're going forward, not to anybody in front of them. They're sat by the side, perfectly safe. perfectly safe. Next slide, please, Alistair. So, hygiene. And again, I've got to reiterate, the control measures we're looking for here are two: social distancing and hygiene. It really is that simple. Really is that simple. So, clean regularly all hard surfaces where skin contact is likely. We'll get into those examples. You can see them right there. They're the obvious things, but I'll read them out anyway, so we've covered everything. Hygiene. Kind of, as a species, humans, we have kind of an almost unique trait in the animal world. We touch our faces with our hands a lot. Recent credible studies indicate that on average, most times subconsciously, we touch our faces between 15 and 23 times an hour. Now, very specific numbers, the 23. In some areas, it's a lot more. In some areas, it's less. But on average, this practice alone will drastically increase the potential for infecting ourselves. So we know this virus enters our body via the mouth, nose, nasal passage, and tear ducts in the eye, if it's not being directly inhaled. And we put it there. We put it there. Through habit, through whatever means. But we are taking something potentially from a surface and putting it directly where it needs to be to get into our system. We know this virus hangs around inside the mouth and throat for a little while, can be there for several days before it actually enters down into our lungs. And if it gets into the lungs, that's where the problems start. If it bypasses, goes to the guts, our natural acids will kill it anyway. But prevention, as in all risk, is everything. If it's possible, reasonably practicable, as they say, you've got to consider it, and in most cases, you must do it. So we're dealing primarily here, again, like I said earlier, primarily with skin. But it is absolutely worth bearing in mind that this virus doesn't just live on skin. It lives quite happily for a less period of time on clothing. And this may be transferred, ironically, by people coming to a door and thinking, well, if I don't touch it with my hands, I'm not likely to spread it, I'm not likely to catch it. So what they'll do is they'll use the side of their arm, or you know, if they're leaning against something, sitting on something, that virus is more than capable of sitting quite happily on your clothing. So although we are dealing predominantly with skin contact, don't forget clothing, and don't forget this virus, the limited amount we know, and it is limited, we know it thrives quite well on many surfaces other than skin and hard surfaces. So all of these considerations, all of this here, the hygiene considerations here, I've got to stress this, are additional to your personal hygiene procedures. Everything is additional. So these are just examples. You can go on and on. There's myriad number of things you can list here, but the obvious stuff, the door handles, the push plates, light switches, handrails, your taps, sink, hand dryers. Now you've got hand dryers in there, you know, certainly the ones where you insert. So you could think, well, if we've just washed properly, what's the chances of transferring that virus onto a hand dryer? Well, it comes down to the previous statement. If you've washed properly, if it's absolutely done right. If not, you know, there's a certain irony that we're implementing and using equipment where we have just put the virus, where we're actually going against what we're trying to achieve here. Toilet flush, seats, telephones, desktops, chairs, printers, everything you find in your kitchens. No point, I'm not going to read them all out to you. They're quite obvious. Basically, anywhere there's a handle, a skin contact is likely. Vending machines, payment devices, machinery, equipment, shared equipment, company vehicles, when you get in, when you get out. All of these, straightforward, but it takes you to recognize what applies to you, what actually is, you need to identify, and there will be a version of this available for you with more details, with everything, with additional details at the end of this. When we're doing the cleaning, one of the considerations is who's going to do that. Is it a free for all? Is it everybody is nominated? Or are we going to nominate people to again further reduce the risk? So we know we've got more control over one or two people doing it, additional to people, periodically throughout the working day doing it. But those are considerations that I think could be forgotten. So who is doing that cleaning? When are they doing that cleaning? What are they using? What are they cleaning? What is the criteria? Do they have a checklist, and so on and so forth? These need to be established and communicated. And bear in mind, normal everyday sanitizing products, disinfectants, etc., absolutely perfect. You don't need nothing special. So your bleaches, your disinfectants, Dettol, that sort of thing. And in a lot of cases, these things are diluted anyway. You can dilute, so it doesn't need to be, it's £1,000 a week to keep getting Dettol through this place. It doesn't need to be that way. Your simple everyday disinfectants and so on, perfectly capable, perfectly sufficient for killing and controlling this virus. And don't forget, as well as your hard surfaces that we can see here, don't forget other areas. Shared stock. So COSH, for example, the materials that you use for your chemicals that go into a stock room and so on and so forth. Everything that anyone else can be requires to share with somebody else. It's a potential contact point and breeding ground for this virus to live in some cases, like I say, for many days. Next slide, please, Alistair. So, provide hand cleaning facilities at appropriate areas. Now, those appropriate areas, they're just that. Where is it appropriate to install hand cleaning facilities? So, entrance doors. So now we're down to the hand sanitizers. But this is additional, this is secondary to hand, warm water, foaming soap. But it's impractical to install sinks, in most cases, at an entrance door. So these are just your additional measures. So you wash when you go in, and vitally important, you wash when you come back out. So you may need 2 stations. You may just need a procedure that once you go in, you do this. Once you go out, you do that. Communal areas, washrooms, obviously. Anywhere you feel is appropriate, where there could be every 10 meters is another one, whatever suits you, whatever applies to your particular environment. Arrange for work clothing to be retained and used only at the premises. Or suitable containment, plastic bag. So they're changed at work, put into a plastic bag. They're transported safely to and from people's homes, where they can be washed or changed accordingly. Perhaps consider personal storage bags for individuals, for work equipment, for their own PPE. PPE, absolutely critical. If you are going down the route or require RPE, so dust disposable masks, what we don't want is people using a mask, using it incorrectly, and absolutely transferring that COVID-19, that virus, straight onto their own mouths, up their nasal, up their nose, and so on. All control. The initial control measures lead to a series of little other considerations and controls. Provide bins for immediate disposal and secure containment, not open bins, not open bins. So you have a swing type bin. That's okay, except there's going to be contact made in and out. What I would be saying is appropriate containment is something where there's a large enough gap to safely drop something in and it's contained. Make sure that whatever waste disposal units you're using, the contents can't easily be touched by others. Otherwise, we're taking people to a place, asking them to do something. What we don't want is then to encourage or allow easy transmission back again. Discontinue use of fingerprint entry systems. This is just for added protection and control. When we get onto the subject of masks, consider that use. FFP2, FFP3. So the disposable filtering face pieces, perfectly acceptable, and they will 100% used right, they will reduce the likelihood of transfer or contraction of COVID-19. When using them, right now, it's a difficult procedure to get people fit tested. So use a colleague or a mirror to help you create that seal, okay? Very straightforward. Anything is going to be better than nothing. And bear in mind, that's just for added protection. If there's already a requirement for you to use that equipment because of the type of work you're doing, you must continue anyway. Don't forget gloves, disposable gloves. There's a way of putting them on. Certainly the way of putting them on is not the problem, it's the way you take them off. You pull one down, you pull the other one through it, it's inside out, it goes in the bin. Don't forget, the use of gloves, a very, very effective way of controlling this virus. Ventilate rooms, another simple but effective control measure. This prevents the containment in a confined space, a defined and confined space. It allows the air to change in those rooms. It allows any of the minute particles to be simply drawn away. Next slide, please, Alistair. So we're onto the fire, the accident and emergency procedures. So right now, the HSE have stated that social distancing does not have to be observed in the event of a fire evacuation or for administering first aid treatment at work. That applies only if it's impractical or unsafe to do so, depending on your circumstances, your individual circumstances. But what I would strongly encourage you to do is review your current fire evacuation procedures, particularly at the muster points, to perhaps allow for, in the event of an evacuation, that social distancing can still be maintained. If it can't, or it's unsafe for whatever reason, you don't have to do it. The importance here is the evacuation of people. First aid. If you're a first aid, trained first aid member, pay particular attention to the wearing of appropriate PPE. So what we mean by appropriate PPE is your obvious stuff, your masks, your goggles, your full face visors, gloves, those things there. You're going to be potentially in a situation, the unenviable situation of having to deal directly with not just whatever incident to an injured person, but you're now in very, very close proximity to this person or people. So don't forget them, and observe thorough hygiene measures immediately afterwards. Now, if on the subject of first aid, you haven't got, for whatever reason, enough cover to absolutely be certain that you are able to deal with anything that may crop up, strongly recommend you do not undertake any high risk tasks. Stop them. Because of the potential that's high risk, I mean, we term high risk, obviously with the control measures, you've reduced that risk, otherwise you wouldn't be undertaking it. Anything particularly high risk where there's, you know, the chances are if this happens, it's going to happen here, but we haven't got enough cover, don't do it. Don't undertake it. Eliminate the risk. Now, if you were taking first aid training and that training was interrupted or stopped because of COVID-19, they are permitting a restart for those people, but that's subject to certain criteria. How far through you've gone, what you were able to determine, and so on. It's the information is available to all of you out there. If your current training for first aid, if your certificate, for want of a better term, has expired on or after the 16th of March this year, for the first time ever, they've allowed a 3-month extension to regain, so it will apply. You're covered. You're classified as trained. Continue on, okay, for 3 months. Next slide, please, Alistair. Delivery drivers. We are nearing the end now. Don't forget them. Make sure that suitable arrangements exist and are known and communicated to them. So this to continue and to maintain social distancing and ensure that any items that they're bringing in and transferred over and documents are hygienically and safely processed. Don't prohibit them from using your welfare facilities. I mean, I'm not being rude, but aside from it being illegal, it's a pretty unfriendly attitude. So make sure they're just compliant with your current arrangements. And don't forget your home workers. The duty of care remains yours with specific regard to their working equipment. Next slide, please, Alistair. Sorry, one from the end. Vital. Communicate clearly all arrangements to staff, essential contractors, delivery drivers, etc. And remember, in accordance with current UK law, any risk assessments that you have, that you need, must be documented if you employ more than 5 people. When you're communicating, consider any language barriers that might exist. Do your arrangements translate well and they're fully understood? Monitor your procedures for effectiveness and staff compliance. Amend if required, communicate them out again. Encourage reporting. This is a difficult one, but that reporting of any incidents of non-compliances, do not accept any breach of your arrangements. Don't laugh them off. Well, there you go. You know, I've spoken to somebody this week who they put in one-way systems, it's being breached, and when they pass each other, they have a quick laugh and say, wow, it's a long way round. Not acceptable. Treat any non-compliances as harsh as you would any other serious health and safety breach. Final slide, please, Alistair. So this is it. Now, more than any other time, focusing on health is at its highest. just remember, it's the legal and your moral responsibility to provide a safe place of work, and for employees to cooperate and comply fully with such arrangements that exist to protect them. Finally, the health aspect, of course, is the absolute priority, but regardless of whether or not another spike occurs, if it becomes even the slightest consideration by the enforcing authorities that you or we as employers are not able or willing to comply with what they're saying, we can assume a return to lockdown will be pretty swift and prolonged, potentially prolonged. The potential consequences to businesses by getting this wrong, taking shortcuts, or simply not bothering, so grave it's all but impossible to quantify. Simply can't afford to get this wrong. So that's it from me. Bear in mind, some of you will have your own internal health and safety managers and consultants. Please speak to them regarding their own arrangements and so on. Please feel free to contact me or Atlas for any further advice, free of charge, or request a copy of our risk assessment, again, free of charge. Just let us know. That's it from me.
There we go. Thank you very much. Paul, extremely thorough. Lots and lots to take in, I think, for all of us as employees and as business owners or managers within business. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, so I'll come to those now. We've got a question around bringing people back in and kind of mental health. I think that might be more of a sort of an HR element, but is there anything that you would pick up on from a health and safety point of view around mental health or people coming back into the workplace?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was, it's a very good point, and there is the health aspect to that. I had a conversation last night with a client who has an office, and that there's only one person in that office. Their anxiety was palpable. This is one person in an office. So the aspect of again, it will move over to the HR scope bill remit, if you like. But whoever brought that question up, it's foreseeable and potential risk. I think I would probably defer to a trained HR person as opposed to...
That was from Debbie Morris from Concilium HR. So thanks, Debbie.
Sorry,
Good question. Next question, and this has come up a couple of times around best practice for employees working within customers' homes.
Right. Okay. So if we're dealing with customers' homes, there's currently, from recent memory, there are several. There is some criteria to observe there. First of all, you have to have the express consent of both parties. So you need the consent of the resident, and you also need the absolute willingness and consent of the tradesperson or tradespersons to undertake that work. From there, a simple questionnaire or set of instructions by phone to maintain that social distancing, because essentially all you're doing is transferring your workplace. The same procedures will apply. But what we'd be asking there is making sure, A, that you have consent of both parties. And in some cases, there may be a third party, landlords, for example. So you may need to be speaking to a landlord if it's a residence, a housing association and so on. But provided you have the consent, and bear in mind, some of the work that's going on inside people's houses are critical. Gas safe, for example, they have their own set of procedures at the moment, but they're pretty much in line with everybody else. Maintain that social distancing, maintain that hygiene, but get consent from both parties.
Okay, and then apply those rules that you would apply to the normal workplace in the home.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely. Great. Thank you very much.
No change.
Got a question on fans. Heard that government departments have withdrawn fans from the workplace. Is it advised that we do not use fans in the workplace?
No. The variations between what one person is saying and what one person is doing, that's individual consideration. So what we don't want now is to create these secondary hazards. So if there's a need for a fan, the consideration is the direction, perhaps the direction that air is being transferred, direction of travel. But it's the chances of the aerosol particles are much lower than the droplets. Okay, so once it becomes airborne, I mean, it's airborne and it's dispersed pretty quick. I wouldn't discontinue the use of fans personally. I would just look at the individual and on merit, the environment it's being used in, and where can we divert that to? Are there windows we can open up and divert it past and out the windows, for example? Yeah.
Lizzie has asked a question which I was actually going to ask, which is sort of an extension to that, which is around air conditioning. Anything to consider on air conditioning?
No. Air conditioning, to be honest with you, is I would consider as a control measure, because it's changing the air. It's not allowing that stagnant, the air to remain exactly as it was. But again, if we're using air conditioning, it would suggest, I would say, in a lot of cases, that you have the availability of windows. Again, I would move the most logical one, open windows where that's not practical. Air conditioning, there's no requirement for it to stop. And I would personally say it creates air movement and it doesn't allow it to hang in the air.
And I guess air conditioning systems would have filters in them anyway, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. So, yeah, okay. Absolutely.
Good. Question on multiple people using paperwork and files. I guess that's difficult if multiple people are accessing the same piece of paper.
Yep. Okay. We're again. So shared documents. Documentation should simply be considered and viewed as work equipment. That is what now it would be. I would have thought a pretty straightforward situation to be able to control the multiple handling of any documentation, and for the time being, where possible, can consider generating and holding these documents until such point and send them through for them to. I don't necessarily has to be this piece of paper must go to this person. So, but if you can consider even a paper as a piece of work equipment and apply the same measures you would with everything, no problem. Just simple considerations.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, and a question around an office building with multiple businesses, including a cafe. I guess the obvious advice would be to avoid the cafe if it's open. Encourage people to bring their own food and drink in.
Yeah, well, as far as I'm aware, and I may be wrong on this, so if I am, I apologize. As far as I'm aware, the cafe type situation, I think you're probably talking about, within a workplace, obviously not a. If they are open, they, as well as all those other businesses, if they're working, they must comply fully. Now, this is where it goes back to reporting. So they have to comply as well. They have to have their own arrangements, and collectively, whether it's you as an individual business or a collective arrangement, compliance will apply just as much to them as to you, and so on. And for me, personally, the first port of call for me always with risk is eliminate. Is there an absolute need that you go to that cafe? If there isn't, it is as simple as that. Don't go.
Okay. Yeah. I think the follow-up is that it's a public cafe that wants to open in July. Well, I guess they're going to be limited by what the government advice is going to be anyway on hospitality venues. and if they do open, they're going to have to comply with the health and safety requirements for the hospitality and catering sector anyway.
Yeah,
I think as Paul says, and as you mentioned, if you can eliminate the risk, it's easier to eliminate it than try and mitigate against it.
And I think for everybody who's still here now, even up to this morning, me leaving work, there are changes happening. This government now, this part of the UK is not doing this, and so this part of the country is not. This is an evolving situation. So what applies right now might not apply 5 o'clock this afternoon.
Yeah, and certainly that's what we've been experiencing as a chamber, is trying to take that advice that is normally delivered at 5 o'clock on a Friday, thanks very much, and making it into something that businesses can understand.
Absolutely.
The question here: are gloves and masks essential due to the shortage? Is this still relevant? No. Are we still seeing a shortage of PPE?
In essence, no. From my end, now I can only speak from personal experience and what's happening right now. I'm not aware of a particular shortage that is that we have availability to PPE.
Yeah. Okay.
What I would say is that question is actually a very good question. No, it's not essential unless it's an essential part of what you're doing as your job. So if part of your risk assessment has identified a particular task as mandatory requirement of PPE, it's essential. So bear in mind the health of every employee, every person here today, and their staff and so on. Their health is absolutely equal to the health of NHS workers, all frontline staff and so on. But if it's not essential, it's merely a consideration. If it's not essential, no, you don't need to use it, but you must have provided alternative control measures to mitigate the risk. So
that health and safety assessment identifies whether or not it's essential to have it, and you go from there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay. Apologies if anyone's getting any background noise. I think my neighbours decided to do some strimming, which is helpful. I think, Paul, you mentioned that you had a presentation which goes into a little bit more detail than the simple bullet points on here, which we will circulate to everybody on the call as well. This video will go online in terms of if you want to refer back to it, or if you need to disseminate it within Teams, you can do it via that as well. So this will go onto the Chamber website probably later this afternoon, early tomorrow morning. We've got one more question. Apparently FFP3 masks are in short supply with requirement for working construction or on waiting list for them. Advice to construction is that these masks should be used, and others who do not carry out the task for which the masks are intended should not be using them. So yeah, that kind of follows up that risk assessment. If it's needed for that task, you should be using it. Obviously, if it's not required, there's no need to.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right,
okay.
I'm going
to...
Go on.
Restricted to FFP3. FFP2 equally acceptable and recognised as a perfectly usable piece of equipment.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Right. On that note, I'm going to say thank you very much to Paul Perry from Atlas Safety Management. Thank you all to you as well for being here and taking part. You know, there's some really useful information and thoughts. Barry's clapping. Thank you, Barry.